Hi, this is Jen, and we're here for another exciting, wonderful episode of Mom Cave Live with someone who's going to be giving us some really great wisdom about raising other people's children. But before we do that, let's just show you our little intro.
Honey, hurry!
It doesn't work. Oh, welcome to Mom Cave Live, where we may have lost our minds, but we haven't lost our senses of humor. I'm Jen, and we have a really fun guest today. More than fun, she's going to be really helpful too. So let me just bring her on. Here she comes. Hi, this is Debbie Ausburn. Hi, Debbie.
Hi, how are you?
Good. You know, we've got the two cameras going, so it's like you're a movie star. You have your side view and your front view.
That's right.
Yeah. Great to see you. So the title of your book is exactly what we want to talk about here, and it's Raising Other People's Children. There it is. What foster parenting taught me about bringing together a blended family. So we have a lot of blended families that are around here on Mom Cave, and there are foster families, there are step parenting families, grandparenting families, every kind of family imaginable, and we need to know how to make it work.
Okay.
Yeah, you're like, okay.
yes. Well, I've done all of it except biological families. I've never had any biological kids, but I've collected 7 kids and 10 grandkids.
Wow. Okay, so you're the stepmama to 7 kids.
Well, I'm stepmom to 5 kids, and then there's 2 of my foster daughters that became part of the family.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you've kind of run the gamut. You also in your other life, you're an attorney, correct?
Right. Yes. That's how I pay my bills.
Well, we all need to pay our bills, for sure. But I was reading that you also, as an attorney, have a lot of experience in like family law and these kinds of.
I don't work with domestic issues like family law, which is I don't do divorce and that kind of stuff. But
Right.
what I do is I represent organizations that work with kids.
Okay.
So I do a lot of work with camps, schools, childcare centers, mentoring organizations,
Right.
service providers.
Protecting kids.
Protecting kids, yes.
That's a wonderful thing. Yeah. Well, okay. Could anybody who has any questions for Debbie, go ahead and pop them in the comments. And of course, we're going to give away a copy of her book to someone who comments. So kind of start me in the beginning of your story, if you would.
Okay. Well, I started out, my parents were always very involved in youth ministries at our church and working with at-risk kids. And so when I graduated from college, it was sort of a natural to go into working in that field. I worked as a probation officer with juvenile court in Metro Atlanta. A lot of it involved social work, although I was never a licensed social worker, but I was essentially a social worker in the job. I burned out. I got tired of dipping out the ocean with a teaspoon and retreated to law school. But even as a lawyer, I stayed involved with organizations and volunteering with kids, and eventually found myself as a foster parent. And I did different kinds. I started out as an emergency placement and then did respite care, and then eventually had a couple of long-term placements. And so then I left that job. I came back to home to Georgia. My mom had a stroke. My brother and sister were raising children without my advice. So
without your advice, they needed you.
Right. They needed me. So,
you must be the oldest sibling.
I am. Is it obvious?
Yes, I'm an oldest sibling as well. So they never listened to you. If only they did. It's like
my siblings and my kids, their life would just be so much easier
Yeah,
if they
exactly.
listened
They
to
listen
me.
to us, but whatever. So so you went back to help with all of
So
that.
that's right. That's right. So I moved back home and then met and fell in love with a man with 5 kids. Now it's not as bad as it sounds. 3 of the kids were adults, so only 2 of them were still
Only
at
2 that
home.
needed parenting at that point.
Oh, they keep coming back. So I
Mhm.
joke right now. Our middle son and his teenage daughter, they've moved into our basement temporarily 11 years ago. So we still
It's all relative. 11 years
it's all
is
relative.
temporary in the
It's
scheme of the whole lifetime.
That's right. It's still temporary. But
Right.
but we have a good relationship, and that it's they have their space, and we have our space,
Perfect.
and it works out. But we still we have good relationship with most of the kids. One of the foster kids, one of the step kids is, they make the decisions, and they
Mhm.
pull away, and you just kind of wait for them to come back. But that's part of parenting other people's kids. It's one of the things I've discovered is that with foster kids and step kids, we're not the people who are supposed to be in their lives from their perspective,
Mhm.
and so we have to give them space to work through that. And
Yes.
some it takes longer than others.
Yeah. I mean, in there's a similar phenomenon, I guess you would say, even with biological children, in that
Oh yeah,
they have to pull away and become independent, and sometimes that part is pretty painful. There's sort of a rejection of where you came from. I think everyone goes through that a little bit in
mhm,
adolescence, and then hopefully, ideally, you at least I did. You come back and think to, wow, like these are the people that I love, and you come back to
right.
it. You appreciate things later, but you have to grow before you can.
The, the way I phrase it with teenagers is the aliens will return their brains eventually.
Oh, thank
So
God.
you just have to wait for
Okay,
it.
I know. Thank God.
That's
Great.
right.
So, anyone who's watching, drop a comment if you are a foster parent or a step parent, or you are helping raise someone else's child. Um, Debbie, like let's go with the step parenting aspect.
Mhm.
When you first meet someone and they have children, or you have children, or both, what do you think is the most important thing to think about with regard to the kids?
With regard to the kids, you have to decide early on what your lane is. And like I said, from the kids' perspective, you're not supposed to be in their lives. They're supposed to have biological intact family. That's the way that kids are hardwired. And when things don't work that way, there's always all sorts of good reasons that the intact family falls apart. But it still leaves the kids feeling that something's off kilter. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's just, and if we as step parents come in and start trying to do too much too soon, then we're going to torpedo the relationship. I have a great relationship with my stepkids and started out on a good relationship, but I understood from having been a foster parent that my role was not to replace their mom.
Yeah.
They have a mom. She's very involved and she loves them very much. And my role was as more of a mentor.
Hmm.
And so if you think of it in terms of fairy tales, I actually used to joke with my boys that I had read all the manuals for being a stepmother, Hansel and Gretel and
Right.
Snow White and all of those. I knew how to, but the stereotype is there, and I think it's because we as a species, we're a storytelling species. We
Mhm.
tell ourselves stories. It's how we pass on information. It's how we make sense of our world. And kids they have a narrative for their lives. And of course, they're always the hero in their story.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
and the role for us is either the villain or the mentor.
Mhm.
And those are really the only two options for us. We're not going to be the parents. We're only
Mm.
going to be either the mentor or the villain. And that's where we have to understand that our lane is being a mentor, not a parent. Or if we're not careful, it's just very easy to slot us into being the villain.
Right, right. And how, when you have a kid who isn't feeling it, is thinking that you're more the villain, um,
Right.
how do you push them towards that idea of that you can be a mentor to them? How do you show them that?
Well, you don't push them, you show them.
Right.
And so you have to give them space. You have to let them, give them permission to feel whatever they feel. Now, you still have to set boundaries. Every healthy relationship has boundaries,
Hmm.
and so that doesn't mean that we just put up with all sorts of crap from them.
Right.
But we present it in a very calm way of, for example, one of my personal boundaries is I just don't let people curse at me.
Hmm.
And when somebody starts, I just withdraw from the conversation. Just let's talk about this later.
Right.
And I don't respond. I don't yell back if it's any of the kids. If it happens on the phone, I hang up. If
Hmm.
it happens in person, I just say, We'll discuss this later," and I go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's a way of drawing a boundary in a very calm manner. And if they want to talk to me, this is how you talk to me. Um, so you do have to balance that line between expecting respect, but giving them space to be whatever, feel whatever else they want to feel, and have room for the relationship to grow organically. So I would say that if you've got a kid who's rejecting you, which I've had,
Hmm.
you understand. You say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that your parents are not together," or as I would say with my foster kids, I'm sorry your mom's not here. Um, I'm here. I love you, and these are the house rules.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's hard to set boundaries with kids
Yeah,
when
yeah.
and when they don't respect you as much, even harder, I'm sure. Yeah. Um, can you think of something that is surprising, or most people would find surprising, possibly, about being a foster parent?
I would say in many ways, being a single foster parent was easier than being a married foster parent, and people tend to not realize that, and it's because when I was definitely there's downsides to being a single foster parent, any kind of single parent, because I was the only pair of hands,
Right.
and I had to build a safety net of people to pick up my kids at school and that sort of stuff. When I was married, I had a built-in backstop to do those sort of things. But the part that made it hard is this wonderful, generous, reasonable man that I married had different opinions.
Hmm.
He didn't agree with me,
Again, like
and
siblings and children, if only the
yeah,
spouse would agree with us and listen to us, things would be so
that's
much
right.
easier.
I had been doing this. I knew what I was doing.
Right,
Once,
right.
So the part that surprised me was having to get on the same page as my spouse, or at the
Hmm.
very least, agree to disagree, but decide whose lane this was in.
Uh-huh.
And generally, if you're disagreeing with your spouse, the biological parent gets they're the ones who make the final decision because they're the ones that the kids are connected to.
Right. That's fair, I think. Yeah.
Yeah,
Are there
well,
resources for dealing with those sorts of the spousal disagreements? Is there anyone who can help you? Is there anywhere you can turn when you're having that problem while parenting?
well, I would, counseling, or in our case, we had trusted adults that we both respected and
Mhm.
were willing to listen to, people who had been experienced. I would say one of the things that we had to work through was as not so much with the stepkids, but we ended up one of my one of my former foster kids hit a really bad patch, and so we inherited a grandchild for 5 years who had been through a lot of trauma,
Mhm.
and the trauma was unexpected for my husband, and even I, as experienced as I was with kids who had suffered trauma, didn't recognize a lot of it because the child was so good at hiding it from us.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that's one of the things that we have to realize is that, even divorce with kids is
That's
traumatic. So
trauma. Yeah.
yeah. So if we're a step parent, we know with foster kids, obviously we know they've had trauma. But even with stepkids, they've lost their intact biological family either through death or divorce.
Mhm.
And even though kids are resilient, even though they can be fine on the surface, there is still some level of trauma there that they've suffered. So I think that one of the resources that I always encourage people to go to is not only counseling and not only trusted adults, but learn about the effects of trauma.
Okay.
And there's trauma focused counseling, but if you just look on Google, you'll find all
Mhm.
sorts of things about dealing with kids who've suffered trauma.
That's good. That's a very good thing to remember. We have a comment from Jessica asking, besides cursing, what other boundaries have you set?
The A lot of the boundaries were, like I said, the interpersonal relationships were just some basic level of respect. You don't have to love me, but we have to be respectful to each other.
Mhm.
So there's a sort of a kind of a mishmash of things that are in that. The other things were the boundaries were just house rules, and I learned to present them as house rules rather than our rules or my rules, because there's when you depersonalize, somehow
Right.
kids
Blame it
accept it
on
better.
something else.
That's right. They understand it better. And that also helps with the disconnect they have between living at our house and living at their parents' house, or their by other parents' house. Um, and I learned to I don't I've learned to just say those are the rules there. These are the rules here. So the rules here, for example, curfew and those kind of things are very
Mhm.
obvious.
Yeah.
But being a lawyer, I have a very busy schedule, and I just kind of made clear. My husband had custody of his two boys, so I was able to say, I will stay out of your room. I'm not going to tell you how to clean it up. I, I don't want it to be a health hazard. Short of being a
Right.
health hazard,
We
you
don't need
live
like
there. That's
rodents
right.
or to be condemned or
That's right.
something.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. But you're responsible for doing your own laundry. And as the kids grew up, I shifted more and more responsibility to them. And but some of the boundaries I had were public space has to be clean. If
Mhm.
you carry your stuff into the public space, you got to carry it out. Um, they had chores, and again, I learned that let's take for example, one of my kids just was supposed to take trash out, and he would never remember to take the trash out.
I'll have one of those too.
Yes, yes, and you can fuss at him, you can yell at him. I remember actually saying to my son, uh, so when do you plan to take the trash out? And this kid was a delightful kid because he didn't have a filter until he got a little older. So I
Mhm.
said, when do you what's your plan for taking the trash out? He said, when I got tired of your nagging me about it.
Right.
So I thought, all right, so we have to do something besides nagging here.
Mhm.
So I went back with a technique my mom used, which was when the trash started building up in the kitchen, getting close to overflowing. I just bagged it up and put it in his room, and I kept leaving the trash in
That
his
is
room.
totally my style. I love it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. Well, it
it's your
got it out of my
responsibility.
way.
It's not, I don't want it in my kitchen anymore. You're supposed to take it out in your room.
That's right. That's right. So I learned to look for logical consequences in
Mhm.
those sort of areas and try to replicate life as much as possible. And that's what happens if you don't take the trash out. It piles up.
Right,
And I
right.
just needed it to pile up in his space instead of my space.
Fair enough. Totally clever. I'm gonna flash your book up on the screen real quick for everybody again. Let's see. This is Raising Other People's Children. It should make a link in the comments where you can find the book. Um, I've heard wonderful things about it, and I know that there are so many people here that could use some advice. Let's see. So before we wrap up, I'm trying to think of a really great question. I need to be like, you remember in Inside the Actor Studio when he always had the questions at the end, the
Yes,
same
yes.
questions. I need to have that. But okay. So someone is just became the guardian of their grandchild for the first time.
Mhm.
And they're going through all the thoughts and the emotions and the what the heck do I do's. And if you could just say something to them, what would you tell
Um, Relax, take a deep breath, take things one day at a time. Um, and understand that if you're raising a grandchild, it's because they have trauma in their lives. You may not see it, you may not understand it, you may not even know how bad it is,
them?
but it's there. So one of the things, again, it kind of goes back to boundaries, but understand sometimes that trauma response looks a lot like bad attitude and being
Mm.
obnoxious and being disrespectful and those things. And so you have to learn how to say, no, this is a boundary. You have to be respectful, but I understand where you're coming from, and we need to work on this together. And you need to walk alongside them, and you need to give them the structure, and you need to help them with learning how to adjust to the new situation, but you need to give them a lot of grace and a lot of room to find their way. And I guess the top thing I would say is pick your battles. Don't argue over everything. Make sure that if you have a rule, it is worth going to the mat for that rule, because they will push you, they will push the boundaries, they will test you, and you don't want to do that for everything.
Again, that brings us full circle. Pick your battles also applies to siblings, children,
Yes.
spouses, all of it. Pick your battles.
Yes.
Know what's
Yes.
important to you. Thank you so much. I feel like there's so much that you could share, and there are a million questions people must have. You can put them in the comments, and you can find Debbie at Debbie Ausburn on Instagram, and your website is debbieosburn.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you, Debbie, for talking with me.
Thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks. Okay.